have we lost something? Because I'm so in alignment with everything that you're saying. And Rabbi Jen, to your point, only in kind of the contemporary spaces are we starting to really see the expanse of diverse voices, diverse representation, and thus diverse perspectives. So when I look in my rearview mirror, if I reflect from an ancestral perspective, what might have been different had the woman's voice been lifted in the way that we're starting to see, in the way that you are starting to experience and feeling? What might our world look like had we had this particular insight and these multiple perspectives and the unique sacredness of women 50 years ago or 100 years ago or further back? I don't have a specific person, anybody who feels compelled to respond to that, I would love.
I think about it all the time. I think about I think Bishop Bonnie, it was you who spoke about rigidness and the idea that, that rigidness isn't good for us. And I do think that had we had more diverse voices 100 years ago, 50 years ago, a lot of those boundaries would have been more blurred. And because we know how important it is to have a variety of voices at the table. Women also lead differently. The structure of our institutions would look really different. The power structure would be much more, I think, it'd be much more collaborative, much less hierarchical. I just think there are a lot of small pieces. People don't realize how much of the culture of institutional life, of religious life, is set up in a way that benefits, I don't know, like the way things have always been. And when you bring in more diverse voices, when you bring in a multitude of voices, that blurs in really good ways, I think, and gives a lot of flexibility to a system that has not been super flexible before.
I grew up Roman Catholic, and I'm Jesuit educated, and so my mom always blamed the Jesuits for my downslide into Protestant. But a couple of things happened as at the College of the Holy Cross, where I was a biology major. I took a liberation theology class, and in the midst of that, there was a day on Black theology and a day on feminist theology. And this was right when Rosemary Radford Ruther and Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, this is 1984, 1985, when they were publishing. I was like, oh my God. And so I went to a professor and I said, I want a feminist theology class, right? And so she said, I don't know. I feel like if I teach you this stuff, you guys are all going to leave the church. The Catholic Church. Fair, we all did. But and then I went and did the Jesuit Volunteer Corps, and just lived in West Oakland in the Black Panthers old house, and just had a really interesting immersion. And but I went to Union Theological, and I graduated in '88, and James Cone was my advisor, and
wow.
Jim was my preaching person, and Jim Washington taught me civil rights, and Phyllis Tribble taught me Hebrew Bible, and Bev Harrison taught me ethics. And so I'm going to say, in fact, for myself, I had incredibly, Katie Cannon, I had incredible diverse voices. And for me, when I studied for the general ordination exams and they were talking about theology, I was like, wait a minute, the theology, my bedrock theology is liberation theology and feminist theology.
Awesome.
And what I loved about James Cone is James Cone was really clear. He knew neo-orthodoxy, so he could critique the hell out of it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And as a result, because I had that experience, I came into the Episcopal Church from a different perspective, to be able to have the critique. But then the piece was to be able to do the critique. But as we know, if you're going to do congregational ministry that's going to, I think, meaningful, you have to be able to critique, but then you have to be able to build. You can't just complain.
Right.
And to be able to create the partnerships to then say, yes, here is the critique, here is the sin, here is the evil. Where's the grace? Where's the goodness? Where's the hope? Right. And I think for me, that I got from Jim Forbes as my preaching professor. I mean, it was just like, here's hope. And here's what, this idea of proleptic hope, we believe this and we live into it so that there is something more. And I don't know if that's feminist or liberation or if it's just human. But I know it's what's kept me going for 30 some odd years of ordained ministry. And I'm still smiling mostly.
Wow. Amen on the still
Amen.
smiling, for sure. For sure. Reverend Stancy, I have a follow-up question, but I absolutely want to step back if there's any response to what
I
we
have
heard.
a response, but it's probably not one that's acceptable by everybody in the Baptist.
Oh, let's go.
tradition.
Let's go.
Because
Bring
I
it.
think that maybe I need to be Episcopalian. No, as Baptists, there is no hierarchy. And so every church is allowed to be autonomous and run, which is probably, this is just my thought, part of why it is taking so long to get many of our pastors to accept women in ministry. We still have some hardcore pastors that will not allow a woman in their pulpit. She can teach Sunday school, she can be a nurse, she can be an usher, but she can't preach. And in some cases, she can't teach. So, and I truly believe that it depends upon where you got your education. And some of them, many of them, have not gone to school. I don't know what percentage, I've never looked it up. It takes all I got to just run my own little ship. But I think that has caused some problems, because when we look back at our history, going back into slavery, when we were finally able to have our own church, so to speak, with a master looking on, the preaching had to come across a certain way. And then as the churches developed, that was the one place that Black men could have some prestige. Yep. Because the women were usually the ones that held the household together and did everything. So they weren't really thrilled about having women come in and become preachers. Now, some of them were. So I'm not saying that they didn't exist. Womanist theology will tell you a whole bunch. But I'm just saying that I think that is part of what has caused us to move a little more slowly into accepting the sacredness of women. We're good for organizing fundraisers. We're good for making sure that those tithes and offerings are sent up every Sunday morning, that kind of thing, but not necessarily respected in all cases for leadership. So as I listened to Bonnie, it was like, yep, because that is so rich. I read James Cone. He wasn't one of my instructors. I took womanist theology, and I continue to introduce womanist theology to the women of Safe Sacred Space, because many of them had never heard of it before. Of these 50 or 60 women, they didn't know about womanist theology. They didn't realize that their voice was important, that there was a role for them to play in God's planning.
And the critique that womanist theology brings to feminist theology, which is largely white.
Exactly.
And that critique in our racism and how that is played out. I mean, it's all super. It's super interesting. It's convicting, and so important.
Absolutely.